guys! I'm Maria, and if you're new here, I pretty much talk about the US and its history and politics and its place in the world at large. Sometimes I do some cultural commentary, social commentary. I basically just talk about whatever I want within that sphere. I took a little bit of a break. I was traveling for a few days, but now I'm back and I'm really excited to dive into the topic of this week. The world's kind of a shit show, or well, America is kind of a shit show right now. And you would think that as someone who studied politics and talks about it on the internet, I'd be just like so pumped to talk about the election and the debates and all of that. But I'm just not. I'm tired. I'm weary. I'm beat down. I'm over it. And voting is really important. Please vote. I can't stress that enough. I have a link in my bio that will give you all the information you need to know about voting. I do believe that voter registration deadlines have passed in most states, if not all of them, but if you are registered and you want some information about how to vote safely, there will be resources for you in the link below. That said, I think there are plenty of people all over the internet talking about everything that's going on right now, and I can't bring myself to take up this time, which is like a fun hobby for me, talking about something that is just so unpleasant to me. So, since it's October and I have a big love for all things spooky, I really wanted to take this opportunity and for the next couple of weeks talk about some kind of creepy, weird, spooky stories, urban legends, and things that have happened within the sphere of American politics. I think that's something that doesn't get talked about too often, and it's actually really interesting how spooky our history is. And my goal with these few videos is to kind of talk about each creepy, strange, bizarre topic as not only a series of events or as an event, but as a part of the greater sort of American cultural consciousness. And I recently did 2 parts of a 3-part series all about politics and religion and morality and how sort of the moralization of politics over the course of our history has led to a lot of polarization now. And I still really want to make part 3 of that series. That's going to come in early November. I just honestly wanted to take a little bit of a break from doing a series that heavy, and I wanted to do something sort of October themed, and doing that series would really require me to dive into everything that's going on right now. I just kind of wanted to take a little bit of a break, and that video will be released probably after the election. Let's get into talking a little bit about the Kennedys. The Kennedys are arguably the greatest and most recognizable political dynasty in American history. When I say greatest, I mean biggest and most recognizable. I don't mean great like, ooh, go Kennedys! But I'm not here to talk about their political stances per se. I'm more here to talk about the Kennedys as this phenomenon of the American political dynasty and to talk about the alleged Kennedy curse. Let's just get into it. Let's talk a bit about the Kennedys' arrival here and how they got into politics in the first place. So the Kennedys arrived in America from Ireland in 1849, and they've actually been involved in American politics since 1884. And this involvement began with P.J. Kennedy, who was a member of the Massachusetts state legislature for 11 years, so from 1884 to 1895. And since then, the Kennedys have been one of the most easily recognizable, iconic, and influential political figures and political dynasties in American history. Of course, you have John Fitzgerald Kennedy, aka JFK, who was the 35th president of the United States from 1960 to his assassination in 1963. You have his brother, Robert Kennedy, who served as Attorney General during JFK's presidency and was also a state senator until his death in 1968. And you've got Edward, aka Ted Kennedy, who was a U.S. senator for about 42 years until he passed away in 2009. And then you've got Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who was actually the first Kennedy woman to become directly involved in politics when she was elected Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts in 1995. Now, this is just a really short list of some of the most prominent and popular political figures within the Kennedy family. There were so many other Kennedys who were and have been involved in politics, and they continue to be the single family with the most widespread and long-standing political involvement in American history. And of course, the Kennedys' significance in American politics extends far beyond the fact that individual family members held office. I think that as a family unit, the Kennedys sort of represent the quintessential American politician from the mid-20th century. You have the standard qualities that they represent that were pretty universally held by most American politicians of their time, which is, whiteness, wealth, and elite Ivy League education. But then you also have these markers and qualities that I think maybe because of the Kennedys have become these iconic hallmarks of the American political elite. You have this preppy New England aesthetic, you have these Ivy League roots, and I think when you think of the Kennedys and sort of by extension of the elite moderate Democrat in American politics, you sort of get these quintessential images, or at least I do, of sailboats and Brooks Brothers suits and white teeth. I just have a very clear picture in my head of the modern liberal moderate, and I think that picture is heavily influenced by the Kennedy family. But we're actually going to talk about the Kennedys as cultural symbols a little bit later on. Right now, I want to dive into the so-called Kennedy curse. The Kennedy curse has kind of been a term used for this horrible trend of really devastating accidents and tragic deaths and just horrible things happening to members of the Kennedy family. And I think the most notable example of this, of course, the most famous, was JFK's assassination. So in November of 1963, while riding in a convertible car during a parade in Dallas, Texas with his wife Jackie, John F. Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald, and he passed away in the Parkland Hospital in Dallas later that same day. I think that to call JFK's death a national tragedy is kind of to only scratch the surface. From championing the civil rights movement to introducing a host of other unprecedentedly progressive ideals, JFK, though he was by no means perfect, did represent to the American public this opportunity for the United States to step into the future. And his untimely assassination went far beyond being just the death of a president. It was a crushing blow to everything he represented to the American people. And unfortunately, John F. Kennedy was not the only member of his family to have died young. So just a little bit of background. John F. Kennedy was one of 9 siblings, all of whom were the children of Rose and Joe Kennedy Sr. And Rose is really one of the most iconic members of the Kennedy family. And that's not just because she was the Kennedy matriarch during the family's most prominent rise to power. She's become iconic because she's such a symbol of tragedy because of all she's endured when it comes to her children. So in 1944, Rose's oldest son, Joe Jr., who was a Navy pilot, was actually killed in a plane crash while on a classified mission. And in 1948, Rose and Joe lost another child prematurely to a plane crash. This was Kathleen Kennedy, who died in a plane crash in France. And we've talked about this one already, but in 1963, their son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas. And in 1968, Robert Kennedy died after being shot the night that he won the California Democratic primary when running for president. Believe it or not, but losing 4 of her children in assassinations or freak accidents weren't the only tragedies that Rose endured. One of her daughters, Rosemary Kennedy, who was born with some cognitive differences, actually underwent a lobotomy when she was 22 years old in 1941, and she was never the same and had to be hospitalized. And in 1961, Rose's husband, Joe Sr., underwent a massive stroke and ended up passing away 7 years later in 1968, which was the same year as their son, Robert. So, the Kennedy curse obviously refers partly to the tragedies surrounding Rose's immediate family, but the Kennedy tragedies don't stop there. There are actually so many more Kennedys who have suffered or died in really tragic, often freak accidents. You've got David Kennedy, who was the grandson of Rose and Joe Sr., who died from a drug overdose in 1984. You've got Michael LeMoyne Kennedy, who was another one of their grandchildren, who died of a skiing accident in 1997. John F. Kennedy Jr., JFK's son, died in 1999 when a plane that he was piloting crashed off the coast of Massachusetts, and his wife and her sister passed away as well. Kara Kennedy, who was Ted's daughter, actually suffered a heart attack at the age of 51 while she was at the gym and passed away in 2011. Saoirse Kennedy Hill, who was Robert Kennedy's granddaughter, died of a drug overdose in August of 2019. And Maeve Kennedy McKean, who was the daughter of Kathleen Kennedy, went missing on a canoe trip with her son Gideon earlier this year in 2020, and their bodies were actually found a few days later. So this horrible and tragic chain of events within the Kennedy family extends back about 80 years, and it's made all the more eerie by the fact that the vast majority of these deaths were either freak accidents or assassinations. And on top of that, all of those who died young. The Kennedy curse encompasses not only premature deaths, but also a series of bizarre, tragic incidents wherein members of the Kennedy family or their friends and companions were either seriously harmed or killed. This includes things like Rosemary's hospitalization and lobotomy, and Ted nearly dying in yet another plane crash in 1964. And in 1969, Ted and his companion, Mary Jo Kopechne, drove off a bridge in Chappaquiddick, Massachusetts, and Mary Jo actually died. This is known as the Chappaquiddick incident. It was a really scandalous and controversial thing at the time. You can make an entire video about that, and plenty of YouTubers have, so I'll link one of the most compelling videos that I've seen down below if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. It was absolutely insane. And I mean, like, this is getting to a point where it's really morbid, but the devastating incidents seriously go on and on. You've got Joseph Kennedy II being involved in a car crash that left one of the passengers paralyzed, and then you've got Edward Kennedy losing his right leg to bone cancer when he was only 12 years old. So it's safe to say that this bizarrely tragic, connected series of events within one family has led to a lot of public speculation about there being some sort of curse on this group of people. You know, is there some sort of supernatural force at play that's resulted in all of these injuries and deaths and tragic accidents? Or is this just a horrible and tragic correlation within a family that spent decades really deeply entrenched in the vitriol and publicity of American politics? So I don't have the answer to that question, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the Kennedys really are the last American political dynasty. They are, for better or for worse, American political royalty, with all of the positive and very negative connotations that that term comes with. What's interesting about the Kennedys is that they rose to political prominence right at the same time that, you know, because of the introduction of television and mass media, American politics was really becoming a spectacle. The rise of the Kennedy family in politics is pretty much exactly parallel to the rise of the American politician as not only a public servant, but as a spectacle, you know, as a celebrity. The Kennedys may not have given birth to that New England political aesthetic that we talked about earlier, but they certainly popularized it and certainly helped to sort of entrench it in the American cultural consciousness. And another thing that I think is really interesting about the Kennedys is that they present this really clear-cut, polished image of this political dynasty, you know, this family of high-achieving, rich, very clean-cut individuals. And that image is in direct opposition to the tragedy and messiness that they also represent because of this alleged Kennedy curse. You know, the Kennedy family is both iconic and infamous, incredibly powerful, but at the same time, there is this sense of powerlessness against all of the horror and tragedy that this family has endured over decades. They exist in this state of almost like juxtaposition. You've got this perfection and this tragedy, you know, all this power and this powerlessness at the same time. And I think another thing that's really interesting is that while they rose right alongside the concept of the American politician as celebrity, they're also still around to see the idea of the politician as a celebrity become really toxic and really problematic and really resented by the American public, right? I mean, look at what's going on right now. Look at our president. The Kennedys have been one of the most influential families, if not the most influential, in not only American politics themselves, but the ways in which the American public perceives politics. At the same time, they've been this long-standing hallmark of tragedy, and the Kennedy curse may be this sort of cheapening of the very real tragedies experienced by real people, regardless of their cultural significance or political power. But it does, I think, pose some really interesting questions and ideas about the role of celebrity in American politics, and how scandal seems to be just as fundamental a part of our political consciousness as policies themselves. But yeah, that's the video. I thought this was a really interesting topic to talk about, just because, you know, obviously the Kennedys are some of the most recognizable figures in American history, and the Kennedy curse is really creepy. So I would love to hear about what you guys think, you know? What do you think is the underlying cause of this curse? Do you think it's some supernatural force, or do you think it's just a really tragic series of events? And I'd love to hear what you think about the Kennedys' role in American politics, like how our perception of politicians have been influenced by them and how those perceptions are currently sort of breaking down given everything that's happening in our country and in our world right now. But if you're still here, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was quite morbid, but hopefully, you know, we didn't just focus on the really tragic parts and we were able to contextualize them into a bigger conversation. That's always my goal. But thank you so much for watching. If you're still here, stay tuned for another sort of creepy, spooky video coming next Tuesday, and have a great day. Bye.